place controlled by infinitely powerful megacorporations, Arosaka, Militech, and the others. Who can say what you'll make of your life in this place? Who can say if you'll make it out alive at all? Hello everyone, and today we're going to be talking about the Cyberpunk Setting. This was written by Mike Pondsmith and has had multiple editions and some spin-offs. This will be a general overview of Cyberpunk, the timeline in which it was made, any retcons that happened due to real-world events, and the various editions, and a little bit of controversy regarding some of the artwork in one of the editions. Also, I will be noting that there are two spin-offs that are largely okay-ish, and there's Netrunner as well. That was a spin-off from Cyberpunk. So if you play the Netrunner card game, this was the game it originated from. The original Cyberpunk was written by Mike Pondsmith and published by RTalsorianGames in 1998, so that makes it almost 40 years old now. It is typically referred to by its second or first edition names, which is Cyberpunk 2020 or Cyberpunk Red, in order to distinguish it from the Cyberpunk genre. This was my first introduction to Cyberpunk as a role-playing setting. However, my first true introduction to Cyberpunk was Neuromancer. Neuromancer is a wonderful book, and if you ever want to read a story set in the cyberpunk world, I don't think of anything better than you can do with Neuromancer, but written by the great William Gibson. So give that a whirl if cyberpunk is your thing. It will give you lots of material for making games. But back to the video. The story begins, now this is just a general overview, the story begins basically in a fictional timeline. However, it splits from 1990. The timeline has been extended with each edition. Therefore, when real-world events happen, there are some retcons that happen. The biggest one being the fall of the Berlin Wall, which did deeply impact the setting. Basically, the games has gone through several editions. The first one was known as Cyberpunk. It was published in 1988, as I said, by RTalsorianGames. It contains 3 books in a box set. That was a 44-page handbook, a 20-page combat book, and a 38-page source book. So you had the Night City source book separate from the other 2 books. This was largely how RPGs were done then. You would have these box sets. D&D did it. A lot of other games did it. OSR was very good with it. I think GURPS did it as well at one point. But you had these boxes, and the red box and the blue box were very important and held quite a lot of cool things. It released some supplements for the setting: Rockaboy, Solar Fortune, Hardwired, and Near Orbit Space Supplement with rules for space travel. This was largely when Cyberpunk was in its nascent stage. This edition became known as Cyberpunk 2013 or 2013.
We're sending you back to the future!
This was people's first exposure to Cyberpunk, if they're my age usually, and people are very nostalgic about this edition. It does feel like someone watched Bubblegum Crisis or Red Bubblegum Crisis and injected Streets of Fire, Blade Runner, as I've said, Neuromancer, and Hardwired. That's by Walter John Williams. This is probably people's favourite edition if they're my age. This isn't my favourite edition simply because there was a lot lacking, and I didn't like the direction it was going with the space travel. I think space travel is still in it, but it's not as big as it was in certain spin-offs. Then we had the second edition, which came in 1990. This was 2 years later, and it's titled Cyberpunk 2020, which featured updated rules of combat, net running, character generation, and it was retconned to include the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification in 1990. It was released as a box set that contained a 222-page softcover, 24-page reference guide and adventure. He also released 2 updated versions, 2.0 and 3.0, or 2.01, depending on how you want to look at it. I do have the 2.01 version from 1993, so that's the version that I will be doing in when I look at the individual versions. The second edition also had quite a lot of supplements. It had 28 supplements and sourcebooks and 6 adventures, also published by RTalsorianGames between 1993 and 96. It also had 12 adventures published by Atlas Games between 91 and 94. Dream Party 9 released Night's Edge in 1992, taking it into a horror theme. That is the spin-off that I will be doing as a separate video. It is a spin-off and it is an Elseworld, so it needs to be treated as such. The alternate world, Cyber Generation, is more kid-focused. It's about teenagers and you're fighting a huge nanotech war in that one. And there's also 2 novels that were published at this time, 95 and 96 respectively. Then we come to the most troubling version of Cyberpunk, 3.0. 3.0 was set in 2030 and was published in 2005. It took this genre into transhumanism territory after the 4th corporate war. We'll come to the corporate wars and the setting in a different video. This is just an overview of the game and publications. The global net is basically crashed and burned and unusable, and lots of data has been lost due to the war and the fallout with it. 6 new subcultures have emerged, known as alt cults, such as the Edgerunner, successors to Cyberpunks in previous editions. People did not like this. People were very annoyed that it went into this direction, but the 4th corporate war is still very much canon. It's told in a slightly different way for the later edition, which I'll come to slightly later. The 3rd edition used a different source engine. It used a fusion instead of the interlock system. Both the change of the setting and the artwork within the book annoyed a lot of people. It was basically, it felt very differently. It's like if you compare the anniversary edition of Vampire the Masquerade to 5.0, it's a completely different feel of the world and the setting. Now, if you like that direction that BTM went, that's fine, but a lot of people didn't like the way it went with Cyberpunk. Maybe it was a bit ahead of its time in some respects. It felt very differently because you were changing the way the game worked and you were changing the artwork as well. You know, this very gritty, black and white contrasty artwork and like neo cityscapes with masses of billboards and neon lights, and it was very dingy. Well, I'll show some pictures when I review the book. Basically, 3.0 was very troubled. It was only lasted until last year, so we were on 3.0 until last year, but a lot of people had ignored it and just used the previous editions as I've referred. 3rd edition was very, very controversial to some. 207 to 8, 2 source books were published to accompany this edition. Again, it wasn't very well received, so it didn't receive the massive support previous editions did. Now we're in Cyberpunk Red, which is the 4th edition, set before the video game 2077. The game is set after the 4th corporate war again. However, the events do differ from 3.0, as I've already discussed, and it's considered to be a separate timeline. Basically, he carried on. So you can largely ignore 3.0, but I will be covering it because it's a nice piece of TTRPG development and history. Going from that, Cyberpunk 2077 and Cyberpunk Red were supposed to release simultaneously. The print edition that we got was in 2020, and I think it was October, November, and then they shortly after 2077 released. So it was because the Cyberpunk 2077 was delayed a bit. We had the TTRPG before the video game. Okay, so I liked the video game, and I know a lot of people don't like it, but I do like it. I like the way its direction's going. I like the characters. However, there is some issues with the game, and maybe I will discuss that in a separate video. Other media. Collectible card games. Netrunner is by Richard Garfield and was released by Wizards of the Coast. It's been renamed to Android Netrunner and no longer associated with the Cyberpunk universe. Second set was called Cyberpunk CCG, released in 2003, designed by Peter Wax and published by Social Games. Combat Zone is the miniature version of this game, published by RTalsorianGames and Monster Fight Club, and it's due to be released this year. I believe it's already out now. Cyberpunk 2077 is not the first video game in the series. That was the first one for 1993 called Cyberpunks. In 2007, a 2D platformer was released called Cyberpunk Araska's Plot. For the J2ME platform in 2020, of course, we had Cyberpunk 2077 by CD Projekt Red of the Witcher studio. The game itself has had a rather long history, so it's got 40 years of history behind it. So this is going to take quite a few videos, and this is more of an experimental project on my behalf, where I'll be looking back at editions, saying what I liked about them, saying what I didn't like about them. And if you did like 3.0, I will be ripping on it considerably, because it did have a lot of problems. It did have a lot of problems, but that's not to say every edition of a game can be good. Looking at you, 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. I'm looking at you, maybe Vampire the Masquerade 5.0. But we can't all enjoy the same games. Cyberpunk is a massive, massive genre, and RTalsorianGames and Mike Pondsmith's view of the future has largely inspired my view of Cyberpunk and how it should look. There are a lot of bigger companies that are inspired by it, and books and art and other things that are inspired by this genre, and mostly by Mike Pondsmith's view and a vision of the future. A lot of what we get with these neopunk gangs is partially inspired by Mike Pondsmith. I don't think that it's a coincidence that Netrunner and all those things, and then this game appeared, and then it sort of exploded, was a coincidence. I think everything was at the right time, and I think the game itself largely deals with a city called Night City, which is a free city state. Now, I'll get into that a bit later, but what I will leave you with is, imagine if New York had a child that was in California and was insane with Florida Man memes. That's basically how I would describe Night City to someone who was unfamiliar with it. So there we go. That's just been a brief look at Cyberpunk, the genre, and the games created by Mike Pondsmith. And next we will be looking at the 1st edition rulebook and the sourcebook, and going from there. So I've been Trix, and you've been all of you. That's been my look-see at Cyberpunk, the setting. Thank you all for your time. Do take care of yourselves, and bye-bye.